So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this author spotlight with Charles Kamasaki. We are so thrilled to have the opportunity to host Charles today and to talk a little bit about not only this book, but also his experiences with immigration reform. But before we do that, I just want to welcome you on behalf of the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. We are the cooperating organization nonprofit that works with Angel Island State Park to help preserve the buildings at the site and to ensure that they remain standing so that people can come and learn about this history, this important chapter in US and national history that unfortunately is not often talked about in schools outside of California. And so one of the things that we hope is that you all have a chance to come and visit Angel Island in person, because there's nothing that replaces actually walking through the rooms and the hallways of those buildings to feel a sense of the history that happened there and its connection to today. One of the things that we're also very thankful for is that we had a number of organizations who helped to co-host tonight's event, including the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. Thank you, Leanne. And I also just wanted to make a special note that we have the Iraqi family joining us tonight, and they have a very strong connection to the initial efforts back in the 1970s. The late George Iraqi was instrumental in terms of helping to light the powder keg that ultimately set off the wave of events to preserve the building. So thank you for being here tonight. Also want to thank the American Immigration Lawyers Association, the Northern California chapter, for co-hosting, and then also Asian Americans Advancing Justice, the Asian Law Caucus. And we have their executive director tonight to also share a few words of welcome.
Oh, thank you, Ed. Hi, everyone. My name's Arthi Kohli. I'm the executive director of Asian Law Caucus. Oh, I have to be here, sorry. Oh, there's your camera, okay. It's a pleasure for me to host. I've known Charles since I landed in DC as a very young lawyer in 1997, knowing like not much at all. And he was definitely one of the wise folks there who was, don't laugh, who was guiding many of us as we were trying to navigate what at that time in '96 was one of the worst immigration laws, if you're familiar, that was passed, AIISF, as we were figuring out a strategy how to push back on that. And I've spent most of my career on that. But Charles has and I've been doing this work now for 25 years, and so Charles has many more years of experience, having gone through IRCA and so many, different pieces of legislation that have changed people's lives. And so really, I'm so pleased to be here with you, and I'm so glad that you undertook this massive effort. This is a really important recording of the immigrant justice movement's history. And so thank you for what you've done, Charles.
And so I've also had the pleasure of working with Charles as part of a national collaborative that was previously funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. His organization, Unidos US, which is formerly the National Council for La Raza, was one of the several anchor institutions along with the organization that I previously worked at. So I remember, Charles, you talking about writing this book, and that stretched for a couple of years. And so it was wonderful to finally have a chance to read this book and to get a snapshot really of this long journey and a kind of a glimpse into the sausage making of legislative policy and immigration policy. But let me just properly introduce you to the audience and to our viewers who are going to be watching the recording of this online. Charles Kamasaki is currently the senior advisor of Unidos US, which is one of the nation's largest Hispanic civil rights groups and advocacy organizations. He previously served as their executive vice president for 2 decades, where he managed the group's research, their policy analysis, and their advocacy work. He's also authored and co-authored and supervised numbers of different publications and policy reports and research reports. He's testified before Congress. and has been actively involved in so many different parts of not only immigration policy, but other legal policies that impact social justice and racial equity for so many communities across the country. And he's also a distinguished visiting scholar at the Cornell Law School and is a fellow at the Migration Policy Institute, where he conducted the research that eventually became part of this book, Immigration Reform, The Corpse That Will Never Die, or that will not die, not will never die. This just is, again, just a snapshot of what Angel Island looks like for those of you who've not had a chance to visit before. And what is really important about Angel Island is that it truly is a living landmark that symbolizes diverse experiences of racism, of exclusion, of detention, but also of hope and determination. And so again, if you've not had a chance to visit before, please make the trek out there. Before we delve into the book itself, we wanted to spend just a little bit of time getting to know Charles, although I recognize that many of you in this room already know him, but maybe you'll learn something new about him. And so, Charles, the first question that I wanted to ask you is if you could share a little bit about your and your family's immigration heritage.
Yes, thank you, Ed. And first of all, thank you all for coming, and thanks to the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, is that right? For hosting this event. Before we get into my history, you know, Angel Island is such an important symbol that's just not well known by many Americans, and it should be, because it wasn't, you know, it's common for people to say it was the Ellis Island for Asians. And that's only half true, right? It was also the first, arguably, mass immigration detention center in the United States. And that came directly from the Chinese Exclusion Acts and that history. So that duality, that contradiction, that's always been true about immigration policy really is embodied at Angel Island, and the stories of the people, not just the policies, but the people, I think are very, very powerful. So really grateful for being able to do this tonight with you, Ed. You know, my family had a fairly traditional immigration history. My grandparents were immigrants to Hawaii. On one side of the family were people who were working in the sugarcane industry. On the other side of the family, my grandmother came as what was called a picture book bride. She had been widowed in Japan. And in those days, right, it was very hard for widows to find mates. She had kids, but the single male Japanese workers in Hawaii were looking for wives, and they picked them out of a picture book. And so that's, my grandmother lived with us for a number of years, so I was grateful early in my life to have that immigrant experience. One thing I should tell you is, though, I was kind of the contrarian in the family, big surprise to those who know me. My grandmother spoke no English, or virtually no English. And my older brother dutifully went to Japanese school, learned the language, used to converse with her frequently, and between us, I refused to go to Japanese school for whatever reason. Boy, do I regret that now. But we would converse with each other in kind of like a pidgin Hawaiian English. So that was kind of the immigrant experience that I knew. And I didn't hear most of it from her. I heard a lot from my mother, who I was telling some folks here earlier, didn't experience internment in Japan, but experienced really being part of an occupation, right? There literally were soldiers who moved into her neighborhood. They took over the houses of the priests and the Japanese school teachers. And my mother was the youngest, probably the most assimilated of the kids. And so she was the one who was dealing with the authorities during the war, negotiating over ration coupons or things like that. So that was really very much formative in our experience.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Charles. I also wanted to note that if any of you have your own immigration stories or family immigration stories, one of the longest projects that we've had at the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation is our Immigrant Voices Project, where we've collected and curated over 250 stories of immigrants, both those who came through Angel Island as well as those whose journeys have come after Angel Island closed. So we definitely invite you to visit our website, www.aiisf.org, and check out the Immigrant Voices portion of our website. And if you feel so inclined, please submit your family story. We're also in the process of rolling out and ramping up our Immigrant Voices Live series, which actually gives people the opportunity to share their family stories live in front of an audience. So part of your story and part of your journey, Charles, is also having been at Unidos US now for quite a while. Can you share with us a little bit more about how did you land there?
You know, it was a series of happy accidents. So my family moved to the lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas. Just before I entered high school, we moved around a lot. My dad was a government employee, worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. My mom was a teacher. So when we landed in Weslaco, Texas, it was kind of one of the first real racial experiences I had. So this is a town, like many in the lower Rio Grande Valley, that was strictly segregated. There are literally railroad tracks that go through town, and one side of town was Mexican, right? And they were Mexican no matter how many generations their families had lived in the US. And the other side was Anglo. And the high school class, no reason not to betray my age, which was 1973, was the first fully integrated high school class to have graduated from Weslaco High School. Up until really 4 years earlier, there had been 2 junior highs. They had, the school districts, every time the courts would order desegregation, they would redraw the boundaries so as to have the minimum number of Mexican kids in with their kids. So that was like right in front of you. You could not escape the issue of race. And so when I got out of college, I was lucky enough to get into an internship program that placed people in with small cities. And one of those cities, which had just tipped, had just become majority Latino, this was 1979, was was a city that was being assisted by the National Council of La Raza, helping to build affordable housing. So I got to know the NCLR guys, and then after the internship, they said, "Hey, why don't you work, for us?" I'd be okay. I'll do this for a year, and they said, "Okay." And then pretty soon a job opened up in Washington, and I had been doing housing, and so they said, "Oh, why don't you come to Washington and work on housing policy?" I said, "Okay, I'll do that for a couple of years." And then the guy who was doing immigration for NCLR at the time, a guy named Frank Garza, Arnold, you would remember him, left. And they were kind of looking around and was like, "So who's gonna do this immigration thing?" And I was like, "I guess I will." And the rest is history. I really have never left the issue, since then.
And what was it like working at Unidos US back in the early years, especially as someone who identifies and presents as Asian?
Yeah, it's, the Latino community, I think is a very welcoming community. So I should say, when I was in high school, most of my friends were Mexican American. The Anglo community, there were some exceptions. I don't want to, diminish those. But by and large, I was much more accepted by the Mexican American community than by many of the Anglo classmates. So that was, and I'm not 100% sure why that is. I have some theories. I think in part because the Latino community itself is very diverse. It kind of leads to that kind of acceptance. And then when I was as a young advocate at NCLR, when I moved to Washington, D.C., the leading voice for MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, was an Asian, Linda Wong. Again, a very accepting community, and we would joke with each other. Now, our two organizations had some tensions between us, but we would always joke that that we had found Latino organizations and communities to be very welcoming. Now, I will say, at the time, that was not so much true of all civil rights organizations. So famously, there was a purge of, there's no way to say it other than of Jewish lawyers from the black civil rights groups. I get it, right? Agency is important, representation is important, but you never saw anything like that in the Latino community. So at NCLR/Unidos, we've had a couple of chief operating officers, me being one of them, who were non-Latino. The legal director at MALDEF for many years, non-Latino. So it's not an unusual thing at all to have diverse staffs at Latino organizations, and I never really felt anything other than welcome.
That's really great to hear. And what about the flip side of that? Did you get any type of reaction or flack from the Asian American Pacific Islander?
Yeah, some. So there's one kind of big story, and there's one little story that's actually kind of in the book. So a few years ago, there was a big commission report issued by the Migration Policy Institute, actually, on, now it's 15 or 20 years ago, on new directions in immigration policy. And my boss was on the panel, as was Karen Narasaki, then heading Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and we had a disagreement about basically priorities around the legal immigration system. And Karen came to me and said, your boss needs to change her position because, we're otherwise going to lose what was then the fifth preference. Now the fourth preference for brothers and sisters, very important to Asians. And she didn't. So at that point, Karen decided she was going to publicly pull my Asian card. So I could no longer call myself Asian. That was only half joking. But there's an episode in the book that was also kind of became a interesting situation for me. So one of the main issues involved in the Immigration Reform and Control Act, still an issue in today's debate, was the question of guest workers, particularly for agriculture. And Latinos and unions and most civil rights organizations opposed these temporary worker programs, and obviously was supported by the agricultural industry. And one of the leaders of the agricultural industry came from California. He was a guy by the name of Harry Kubo. He headed the Nisei Farmers League. And there's a whole history about how the UFW, the United Farm Workers, had targeted these farms for organizing. Not, I think, so much because of ethnicity, but because they were small, marginal farms. And Harry's genius, even though he was advancing a position I was opposed to, was he pulled all these small farms together into a union of sorts. Like, if we're gonna have to fight a union here, we're gonna create a union of ourselves. They taxed themselves, and they hired like the highest priced Republican lobbyists to carry their water. And they beat us twice. We kind of won in the end. And one evening, Harry, and we worked with the growers kind of in a wary kind of situation where we were on different sides, but at least initially we were both opposed to the legislation. So we kind of like have our battle over here, but then we'd meet occasionally over here. So one night, one of the grower lobbies said, hey, you should come to this dinner with Mr. Kubo. And everybody called him Mr. Kubo. He was, and I went to meet with him, and he unloaded on me. Like, why are you working for those people? You ought to be working for your own people. Da, 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 da. And I was like, hey man, this is what I think is the right position. And then he backed off and we were joshing and friendly. So it was a fascinating kind of like, okay, which side am I on here, right? And hopefully I picked the right side.
Thanks for sharing that, Charles. One last question for you about kind of your journey before we delve into the book. And so when it comes to immigration policy or healthcare policy or education or housing or economics, the Asian American, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community is often seen through a number of different lenses, right? So one of the model minority, where everyone's seen as being universally healthy and wealthy and well-educated, or that of just being missing and invisible from the policy reports, or that of being cast as an other, where you'll see a table chart or graph that has racial ethnic data for Black communities, for Latino communities, for white communities, but then not for Asian American, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, or Native Indigenous communities. One of the other stereotypes is that Asians all look alike, and I believe you have a couple stories related to that experience.
I do. So there's a serious question here, but let me tell a little anecdote. So I think most of the people in this room are old enough to remember the OJ trial, right? And which was televised, and Judge Ito, Japanese American, was very famously presiding over this trial. And he got tons of FaceTime on national TV. And I would occasionally be mistaken for Judge Ito, right? I had a beard, he had a beard, both Japanese American. Well, at the same time in town, there were two other, were about the same age, Japanese Americans. One is a guy named Paul Igasaki. He was the former chair of the EEOC. At that time, he was the, I think, vice chair of the EEOC. And a guy named Stuart Ishimaru, who was then the staff director of the US Commission on Civil Rights, but previously had worked on the Hill for Congressman Don Edwards. And we all had the same experience of all being mistaken for Judge Ito. So at my book launch at Politics and Prose in Washington, D.C., Paul and Stuart both came, and we took a picture and we posted it on social media as the three Itos. But it was really kind of a funny experience. But to go to your point, Asians, like Latinos, have a challenge, but also I think an opportunity. The challenge is this country looks at race for understandable reasons through a black-white binary. There's good reasons for that, and I think bad reasons for that, but that's just a fact. And because both Asians and Latinos are diverse, come in all sorts of skin colors, with all sorts of different histories, we're going to have to navigate this whole set of paradigms differently. Latinos chose a long time ago, and my former boss, Raul Seguirre, the longtime head of the National Council of La Raza, very controversially, consciously decided to pursue what was then called a pan-Latino or a pan-Hispanic agenda. And it was not universally accepted. Like, people didn't even accept, right, that there was a Latino community or a Hispanic community. And there are differences, right? But he would also say, when people say, oh, the community is so diverse, it has so many different backgrounds and so many different countries and so many different statuses and so on and so forth. He would say, but if you're everything, you're also nothing. And if you're nothing, you can't shape public policy. And I think a lot of the pioneers in the Asian Pacific Islander community, and you worry about, is the Pacific Islander piece kind of in or out? That's kind of a whole different set of issues. But I think consciously emulated that model, right? Because there was a time when there was JACL, Japanese American Citizens League, OCA, and there was a Filipino National Organization. There were others that weren't really together all that much. It was, in some ways, I think, immigration policy that brought a lot of those together. I think the Asian community is on this very similar trajectory to Latinos, but with a number of advantages. So when I look at the Asian community now, empowerment-wise, I kind of see where the Latino community was 20 years ago. But with, frankly, more affluence, with a much more powerful representation in among elite institutions. And so just to give you an example, now there were some challenges too, and I'll get to those, but I was stunned by how effectively the community mobilized around Asian American hate a couple of years ago. Now, if the truth be known, if you go, not proportionately, but if you go by the number of hate incidents, there are far more Latinos that are victims of hate violence than there are Latinos. And there are a number of organizations, bless their hearts, that have been trying to get that more visible. And you know, maybe it's because we haven't been that effective, or maybe there are other reasons. But I kind of saw this, you know, organizations with connections to research, documenting and very methodically, right, the levels of Asian hate, making the connections between the, you know, myths around the coronavirus and the outcomes, drawing the, you know, connecting the dots between those kind of widely held myths and misinformation and the hate incidents that were happening. Then I saw that research being translated into the media. So a lot of, you know, very effective op-eds and articles, long form articles were written. And then the leaders of the community also mobilized around, you know, what eventually led to the creation of the Asian American Foundation, right? And a whole response to that. Honestly, I cannot imagine even now that happening in the Latino community for a whole variety of reasons. And part of it has to do with underrepresentation in key institutions like academia, like the media. You know, so I think those are real foundational pillars to build on. If I were to worry as an Asian American advocate, you know, I'm not so much worried about the model minority thing, because frankly, I almost look at if there were a community to aspire to, it would almost be more like the Jewish community, of being almost fully accepted as Americans, being very well represented in the highest echelons of power, really overrepresented, right? As professors, as representatives, as congressmen in the Supreme Court, I mean, other places. But also maintaining a sense of identity and helping to make the country better. That's what I would aspire to if I were an Asian advocate. But I also worry about the kind of East Asian, South Asian, you know, so far, it seems to have been working out that, I mean, so many South Asians, it seems to me, my impression, no data to support it, that come to this country are people who are super well educated, really progressive, you know, super competent, and have really melded very well with, by and large, with the you know, East Asian community that has largely led you know, Asian organizations over time. Is that going to continue? You know, I don't know. I'm sure there are issues that I'm not even aware of. And then I also worry about Pacific Islanders, right, who are kind of in this odd category, almost like the Latino indigenous, the Mixtecos or Zapotecos. It's a community that faces its own unique history and its own unique challenges. And, you know, is the Asian American leadership kind of capable of fully bringing them along, right, as the community advances?
And then also with us rolling off of May being not only ANHPI Heritage Month, but also Jewish American Heritage Month, even with all the assets and resources that the Jewish community has, the amount of anti-Semitism in our country has definitely increased in recent years. So with that context, and also with this picture, just to kind of share two of the itos, well, let's delve into the book itself. So Immigration Reform, The Corpse That Will Not Die. Charles, can you share a little bit about what was your motivation and inspiration for writing this book?
Oh, well, that, it's hard to really know, like, because once you're started on it, you're kind of like stuck and you're on this path. But I think the immediate inspiration was, I started writing this book in 2014. I had been the longtime executive vice president at then NCLR. I was clearly on the downside of my career. I was, not ready to retire then, but could see retirement in sight. And I did have this sense of, maybe I want to do something that's not NCLR branded, right? So there was that kind of hint. The organization had been growing rapidly, and still is growing rapidly. And with that, as a senior executive comes stuff that you got to deal with, bureaucracy, stuff. And that part was never fun. Like, for me, I would do it because I had to do it, but I'd much rather work on policy. I'd much rather work on program work or, So that began to grow on me. And then there was a lunch where I can't even remember what the occasion was, but a number of people who had lobbied the bill and also who had been staff people, actually Mazzoli's and Rodino's, Peter Rodino's chief staff person, a guy named Skip Enders, hosted the lunch. And a bunch of old guys, farts, were, talking, telling stories, reminiscing, but we were all commenting that there wasn't really a good history of what happened with the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And it was a pretty consequential bill, right? Especially looking back in time. And so, I don't think I remember, or I don't remember or thinking that I, should write this book. But after the lunch, Skip, who, we were kind of frenemies. I mean, we weren't always aligned, and we would, trash his boss in the papers, and he would, call us in and dress us down. I mean, we didn't have a totally friendly relationship. But afterwards, he calls, he says, "Charles, you should write the book." And I was, damn, well, maybe I could write the book. So thankfully, I went to my bosses. They agreed to restructure my position. I was able to work part-time, keep my health insurance, keep a steady paycheck, but also devote the time. I thought it would take a couple of years. It ended up taking 5+. Not to mention the fact that even though it's a 560-page book and it may look big to you, the first version was 864 pages. and the publisher was like, we're gonna need some editing here. So that's the story of how the book came to be.
And then the name, the title of the book, The Corpse That Will Not Die. So definitely the Immigration Reform and Control Act went through so many periods where it looked like it was going to pass, but ultimately did. Is that where the title comes from?
Well, yes and no. So I like to tell this story to younger advocates who have been working on immigration reform who are frustrated. And look, we have every reason to be frustrated. But the seeds of IRCA, the first bill that eventually became the 1986 bill, passed the House in 1974. This was a Peter Rodino bill. It passed the House, the Senate refused to take it up. Actually, it was 73. Then he passed it again in 74. Passed the House, Senate wouldn't take it up. So then finally, he got frustrated. He said, I'm gonna pass legislation to create a commission, a blue ribbon commission. And that's ultimately what became IRCA. Even after that, the bill died in 1982, and Arnold Torres, who's a major character in the book, who's right here, was then the executive director of LULAC, used this audacious tactic, of killing the bill via a filibuster by amendment. Nobody would have thought, right? This was a very genteel Washington. I mean, if you were like, a bill had come out of committee and it had passed the Senate and, right, it was going to be put on the House floor, you were expected to kind of like behave yourself. And you could offer a few amendments, but you were expected not to obstruct the bill. So Arnoldo led an effort of a number of advocates to draft 300 amendments that the Hispanic caucus, led by Congressman Ed Roybal, first he threatened, and people literally laughed at him when he threatened to do this. And then he produced the amendment, and the parliamentarian had to accept them because they were all drafted to be germane to the bill. So that's the first time it died. Then the second time it died was in 1984, passed the Senate, passed the House, and again, Arnoldo led this audacious effort of a first ballot boycott of Walter Mondale's nomination. He was the Democratic nominee, of Latino delegates to the convention, because Mondale had not come out against the bill. And that created, and some other things, created sufficient controversy that the bill literally died in the conference committee. And there's still some mystery about how exactly that happened. And some controversy about people's recollections differ. And then the third time, passed the Senate again, passed the House. By this time, the bill each cycle had been getting somewhat better, attracting more Democratic support, but also more Republican opposition. So the third time, the best bill we thought we could get went to the House floor, and the rule died. This is in the House of Representatives, you have to pass a rule governing how many amendments there are going to be, what the terms of the debate are. And we had improved the bill so much that its Republican supporters all pulled their support, and the bill died on the floor. So at that point, everybody assumed the bill is dead. There were literally the bill is dead stories being written. Peter Rodeno said the bill is dead, not going to bring it back. And through a series of, backroom negotiations, the bill was revived. So there's a long, very, very long answer to a short question, I know. So Dan Lundgren, some of you may know that name. He was a former Attorney General of this state, ran for governor a couple times, I guess. Was that Republican supporter of the bill who turned opponent. And after a lot of wrangling, he finally acceded to moving the bill. And so in the New York Times story about how the bill passed, they said, what happened? And he said, the bill was a corpse. And then we saw a toe twitching. And then it was described as a corpse that was finally revived. But where I got the title was the 1990 Act, which followed, also very significant consequential legislation. It died 3 times before it was passed, ultimately. And so when I tell folks these stories these days, I feel like sometimes we give up too easily. That it's like the leadership says a bill's dead, and we say, okay. And I think we often still have cards to play. Now, there may not be cards that everybody would accept, but I think that's often what's necessary to get to yes. So that's the origin of the bill, of the title. I also think most immigration legislation is going to be declared in Washington parlance dead on arrival, right? But every once in a while, these bills pass. And it wasn't just the 86 bill or the 90 bill, but the the IRA, the terrible bill in 1996, despite our best efforts, passed. You know, and it was declared dead on multiple occasions. So it's the kind of thing that everything has to align, and then even then, often these bills die before they are enacted.
Thanks for sharing that explanation. Within this book, you really do give folks who are familiar with how DC works, and especially folks who may not be familiar with what it's like to navigate a bill through the Hill, just a bird's eye picture, right, of all the different pieces and all the different players that are involved in getting legislation to get through the doors. Is there maybe a story or two from your book that you'd like to share with the audience that kind of encapsulates or kind of highlights some of the work that the group did?
Yeah, so the group was a group of advocates, really just 7 or 8 of us. I mean, the immigration field is much bigger now, much larger, in some ways richer, but in other ways more cumbersome, I think. Arnoldo Torres was really the leader of the group, often much to my consternation, because my man disrespected me like the whole time I was there. I was like just this kid, right? But in any event, so one meeting that actually opens the book it wasn't necessarily a consequential meeting, but to me it embodied everything that's weird about Washington. So the opening scene of the book is a meeting that we had with Barney Frank. Many of you would know Congressman Frank, right? Famously became head of the Financial Services Committee, good, stalwart, liberal, progressive. So this was a time when the Simpson-Mazzoli bill, Senator Simpson, Congressman Mazzoli, was a quite restrictionist bill. And we were trying to work on an alternative. And so we had laboriously over, what do you think, Arnold? 30 meetings, 40 meetings at the insular basement?
Several a week.
Often meeting twice a week. We'd start at 6, we'd like stop at 9, and then we'd go to dinner. And you know, there's a reason why lobbying is a young man's game or a young person's game. And then we'd be up in the office, you know, 9 o'clock the next morning, or in my case, close to 10. But so we had drafted this bill, and that Congressman Roybal had agreed to introduce, although that was a challenge in and of itself. And we were in the midst of collecting co-sponsors. And we didn't really think Barney Frank would co-sponsor, but he was such an important player, kind of a liberal on judiciary, but who was supporting this kind of restrictionist legislation. We thought we might be able to move him. And you know, when you normally go into a representative's office, they make some attempt to be nominally, you know, polite, right? So we went into this meeting, and Mr. Frank didn't even get up. He was at his desk. He was smoking a cigar, and he didn't even look at us. And he was reading the newspaper, and he would turn the pages, and he was talking to himself, commenting on the headlines. I mean, and then finally, after, I don't know, 20 minutes, he finally looked up and said, "Okay, tell me what you got, shoot." No, it was like, "I've got 15 minutes. Tell me what you got." And we're thinking, oh my God, he just wasted 15 minutes, you know, just putting us down. But it was kind of emblematic of the challenge that we had just to be heard, even by people who were supposed to be, you know, kind of on our side. So that was kind of the, you know, that was a real awakening for me. The final story is kind of this is really in the 1990 Act. So this was a bill that was supposed to reform legal immigration. Senator Simpson, probably the most important player on immigration, had proposed cutting legal immigration, basically really decimating family immigration. And we had actually beaten him on the floor. on multiple amendments, which was a stunning surprise. And I take no credit for that. That was really my colleague, Cecilia Munoz, who kind of led that effort, recruiting basically conservative senators, Orrin Hatch, Richard Lugar, others who really helped us on those issues. But we're finally in conference. The House had passed a very progressive bill. The Senate had passed a pretty regressive bill, and they were kind of in conference committee trading off back and forth. And the final issue to be decided was temporary protected status for Salvadorans. Right, this was in the midst of the Salvadoran Civil War. Something like 50,000 people had been killed, civilians had been killed in El Salvador, right? Hundreds of thousands of people had come to the US. And the ACLU and Church World Service were kind of leading the effort to provide temporary protected status for them. And Senator Simpson, because Wright was deeply opposed, it was kind of Cold War politics. Although he said something very accurate at the time, he said, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary immigrant. And actually it's been true, because of the 800,000 Salvadorans who were initially granted TPS, they're all, and their families are all still here, wink, wink. But in any event, so the final issue to be resolved was this question of Salvadoran safe haven. Its lead sponsor was a guy named Joe Moakley, really this kind of hack politician from Massachusetts that nobody expected was a pro-immigrant person, but in a nod to how important local politics are, the local Central American coalition had convinced this guy this was his issue. And he kept coming back and coming back and coming back. And he was by then the chairman of the Rules Committee, very important. Right, so he wasn't on the Committee of Jurisdiction, which was the Judiciary Committee, but he had real power. And by then, the Judiciary Committee, because Chairman Rodino had retired, was headed by a guy named Jack Brooks, this kind of cigar-smoking, very cantankerous, kind of like quasi-liberal Texan. I mean, he used to say he was pro-union and pro-gun. That was kind of like Jack Brooks's thing, but he was not necessarily pro-immigrant. But he had to pay attention to what Mr. Moakley wanted, because the deal was, if somebody like Joe Moakley was really angry with you, like a bill with, say, appropriations and earmarks might go to the Rules Committee, and he would just cross them out, right? So you could be having a bridge in your district or a school, and Mr. Moakley could just kill them. So there's this scene where Mr. Moakley made this passionate defense of this provision. And what was funny was then Senator Kennedy, right, who was a nominal supporter of the legislation, but he and Simpson had a deal that it was going to be this bill and no TPS. So Mr. Moakley makes this passionate defense of the provision. Simpson says something like, well, we're not going to support that, are we, Ted? He kind of elbows Mr. Kennedy. And, Ted Kennedy was kind of embarrassed. It was like, oh God, I can't go back on my word to Senator Simpson, but so he said something good about the legislation, but maybe this wasn't the right vehicle for it. And Moakley just went on this rampage of like, what's it gonna take, Simpson? What's it gonna take? And Jack Brooks, who was, again, we didn't see him as a pro-immigrant guy, kind of jumped in at that point and said, speaking in this Texas drawl, very slowly, literally smoking his cigar as you still could in those days, the smoke-filled room, he said, Mr. Simpson, is there any way we can accommodate Mr. Moakley? Because he's a pretty important person over here in the House. And they kind of stared at each other for a moment. And finally, Simpson said, okay, let's have our staffs work on a compromise. And, 800,000 people were protected from deportation as a result. So it was one of these situations where, like, I felt like it was democracy in action. This is how the system is supposed to work. That opposing sides came together, a member was representing a cause that wasn't even important, politically in his district, so much as he had become convinced it was the right thing to do. Simpson was vehemently opposed on the merits, and arguably he was kind of right in what his substantive arguments were. But he compromised because he had to. And that's the way legislation is supposed to work, and so rarely works today.
Thanks, Charles. We actually have some time for any questions, if any of y'all might have some questions for Charles about his experiences.
I just wanted to say, having worked with Charles, your first questions about him being Japanese, Charles was easy to accept amongst us, and LULAC was a very traditional organization, South Texas, Corpus Christi founded. Charles was an anomaly. Here was a Japanese American who lived in the Rio Grande Valley, who knew as much about that environment as any of us would. And he always spoke very well about the situation confronting Mexicans. We never felt that it was a condescension. We never felt that he was trying to be progressive like most phonies that you get into nowadays with progressives. At least that's the way I think he and I both feel. But for me, I kind of want to speak for Charles, but I always thought Charles was very honest about everything. And we accepted him very easy. And I'll tell you, it wasn't always easy to do that with different groups, but the group was extremely diverse. Women, white, Jewish, black. It was just so diverse that it was the most unbelievable experience working with such a diverse group. And Charles always made himself feel like that we considered him less. We never did. He was Jewish.
Just for the record, they made me make the coffee and make copies.
But it was
just for the record.
It was his building, so the coffee was understood. I think the other thing that Charles says today, which he and I went over many, many times since I left DC, is the people quit working. That effort that he talked to you about with Moakley. Simpson did not want to mess with Brooks. And that's why Simpson gives in. But if Moakley wasn't willing to go back, if the people in that Moakley's district were not the ones pushing him, and I think Charles is absolutely right. Today's advocates demand so quick and don't build up to it and don't stick with it long enough, knowing that you have to have 2 or 3 variations of what you're going to finally get. And I think that that's been lost. I once asked Charles, well, why can't we produce or reproduce what we were able to do before? And Charles always said, I'll never forget it, he said it in his office, he goes, Arnold, that was a one and done. That was unique, it was a unique group of people, it could never happen again. And I always thought that it could happen and it should happen and it needed to happen again. But working with him was great. The book is very accurate in so many ways, and I have nothing but praise for my colleague. I'm very proud to have worked with him, and just very proud and very, very honored to hear his history, because he underscores how much Japanese and Mexicans, immigrants, how much we have in common. And I think it's just a fantastic walking example of that.
Or were we supposed to have questions rather than speeches?
I'll give you a question. Hi, Charles. I'm
Hi,
Arthi
Arthi.
Shahani. It's nice to see you in
Pleasure.
person. Really nice to be in the same room with you. And you have so much context and history, and you've been through so many cycles of the immigration debate. I'm not calling you old. I'm saying that you have context. No, but it's something that I think we need more of. And something I wonder is, for example, in the US, a little bit more than half of migrants are women and children. The policy debate, you would never know that from the policy debate. And I wonder, as someone who is herself first generation and a part of media and cultural production and whatnot, does who the immigrant is matter in political debates? Would elevating the fact of who migrants are, elevating the fact that we're talking primarily about women and families at this point, would that have any effect in the partisan football? Because part of me feels cynical and thinks migration is not a problem that politicians even want to solve. It's really convenient football. It always serves an agenda. And so it's naive to think that, there can be anything approaching a factually based conversation. So anyway, I guess the question there really is, does the evolving identity of who migrants are matter? Or have you just seen too much about how politics work such that you think not really?
I don't know, but I guess, so first of all, Arti Shahani, you've probably heard her on NPR, and I guess you have a podcast these days, right? So I guess what I would say is clearly the identity of who we're talking about matters. And just to give you a classic example, many of us have been arguing for some sort of parole status for Central American refugees for decades. I mean, there is some TPS for some groups, but not others. And through Republican and Democratic administrations have been basically getting the back of the hand. But then Afghanistan happens. Now, that not a super popular group, but had super popular protectors or spokespeople, right? High-ranking military people, and as well as everyday soldiers, Marines, right? Who were writing their congresspersons. We got to do something. So the immigration practitioners in this group would know. There was an argument for what we would hear when we would advocate for Central Americans was you can't do group parole. It has to be case by case. You can't do it for a whole country at a time. So if the Afghanistan debacle happens, boom, group parole for Afghanis. I don't begrudge that at all. I think it's exactly the right. In fact, I wish we could be doing more, something like an Afghan Adjustment Act, like the Cuban Adjustment Act happened for Cubans. And then, with the war in Ukraine, same thing, right? Very sympathetic community. Arguably, though, from a strictly humanitarian perspective, with far lower claims than other groups. I mean, after all, right, Poland, France, half of Southern and Eastern Europe, they're accepting and giving work permits and providing assistance to any Ukrainian who comes across the borders to their country, right? That's not true of Central Americans. And it's not like Ukrainians are fleeing persecution in their home country. They're fleeing a war, right? I get it, that's a big deal, but guess what? There are similar kinds of wars and conflicts in Central America. So I do think the identity of the people matters. Now, I think the real question here is, can we change that? Can we somehow figure out the key to making the populations we are advocating for sufficiently sympathetic to spur policy action? And I think there is, but we clearly haven't figured it out. So you just take moral revulsion nationally about kids in cages, right? And family separation. But once you start to actually get to, okay, what's it gonna take to implement solutions? Not so much the forward.
I want
Yeah.
The moral revulsion about kids in cages, I puzzle over this, and maybe I'm being a little too cynical here, but as that was happening, I constantly wondered, is the revulsion, as in the churning out of news story after news story, actually about the partisan battle underlying it? If a Democratic president had been overseeing that kind of treatment, would there have been the same moral revulsion? I don't think so.
Probably not, right? So I think it's accepted that, I don't know what that is. So immigration is, I think, one of those classic, what's called thermostatic issues, right? Immigrants were never more popular than during the Trump administration, right? And now they're not as popular. And so I think there is something to that, Arthi. I guess I would also say we often, in the immigrant rights side of the debate, lack some credibility in advancing some of these interests. Because the honest truth is, there are elements of the asylum system that have been abused. And there are lots of people in the asylum system who don't deserve asylum. And they ought to be deported. That's, when their claims are fairly heard. You never hear that coming from the left. There are people who, need to be deported. People who are criminals, people who are real threats to our country's health and safety and welfare, and you never hear that. All the public hears from us is we oppose all forms of enforcement. Now, technically, right, none of the immigrant rights organizations that at least I work with really support open borders, but you could never tell that from what we often say in public. So I think, personally, and I might be the kind of old guy yelling at kids, for crossing his lawn kind of thing, but I think if we were more honest about what our country's interests actually are, if we would try and speak to the other side a little bit, I think we would have more chance of getting some of those stories accepted. Now, I will also say, going back to Arnold's comment, that's really hard to do these days, because, in the progressive circles, if you're not checking every box, right, you're gonna get hit. I would also say to that, though, so we, many of us in progressive circles, we say, gosh, those Republicans, they're just caving to Trump. They said they were on our side on this issue or that issue, and they're not standing up to him. I think there's a lot of truth to that. But then, where are we on our side when there are people who are saying things that are extremist, who are saying things that we don't really support? Are we standing up to them? And not so much.
So Charles, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for not only the work that you've done around immigration reform, but so many other issues, but also documenting through this book this important to remember chapter. On behalf of the Asian and Pacific Island American Health Forum, the Northern American Immigration Lawyers Association, Northern California chapter, and Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Asian Law Caucus, as well as my colleagues and board and staff at the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. Thank you for joining us, being part of this author spotlight. And if you have not had a chance to pick up his book yet, for those of you who are here in this room, we have free copies for you. For those of you who are watching, please feel free to purchase one online. And we also ask that for those of us who are here in the room to take a moment to share your feedback on tonight's program. We'll be sending this link out to you after the event is over. And we hope that you'll stay in touch with us, to follow us on social media at AIISF.org, or to follow us on our website, www.aiisf.org. We're so happy to have been able to provide this program free of charge for folks. And if you feel so motivated to support our institution and our efforts, we hope that you'll consider making a donation. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much, Charles.
So if I could say something, so Ed, thank you so much. Ed threw this event together because I was coming out for another conference, so thank you for really going out of your way to do that, and it's really such a thrill. You know, Ed and I were both number twos in somewhat diverse organizations for a long time, and there's something of a bond, I think, that builds between those of us who have to satisfy both our bosses and our staffs. And so it's really a thrill for me to be here and to help advance the story of Angel Island, which is so important and really needs to be told. So thank you.